Welcome! I'm going to briefly explain how I use a sponge when I'm painting because I do find it one of the most useful tools in painting. A lot of people choose to use paper towel to control the water on their brush. That works just fine. I'll admit every once in a while that's what I use too, but the sponge for me gives a much more reliable, full spectrum range of control of how much water is on your brush, how much water you're bringing to your palette, and then once you've mixed your paint, how loaded your brush is before it goes to your paper. So the sponges I like to use are just these Acello brand cellulose sponges, plain kitchen sponge, but the nice large size. When you open it up and between painting sessions, when it dries out, it's kind of crusty. You don't want to use it just hard and crusty. It does not absorb water consistently or as well as a wet and wrung out sponge. This originally was purple. It's very well loved. But you get your sponge fully saturated, wring it all the way out so it's not drippy at all, and that's what we're going to work with. The idea here is to limit the variables when you're painting. So watercolor has this reputation of being so uncontrollable and unpredictable, and yes, it definitely is a unique medium. But there's a lot of things you can control or control within, a certain range, and your water and paint ratios and how you bring that onto the paper is one of those. So I can take my brush and I can fully load it with water. I can make it saturated and drippy over and over again. I can go back to that exact same state of a fully saturated brush. I can take it over to my sponge, and if I set it down briefly, I can get rid of the drips so it's not drippy anymore, but it's still a really nice saturated brush. For some things, that might be just what you need. For other things, you might need less water. So the longer your brush is in contact with your sponge, and I would do this sideways, don't jam your brush tip into your sponge, that's hard on it, from the side, and you can rotate or not, the more contact your brush has with the surface of the sponge, the less water there will be on the brush. This is something that just takes practice. Every brush is different. Every brush holds a different amount of water. So there's not like one formula I can give you for how many times you're going to need to touch the sponge or anything. Your different sizes of brushes affect how much they hold different kinds. A flat wash versus a round hold water differently. But the idea is two parts to this. One, I can control how much water I'm bringing into my palette. If I bring a drippy wet brush over here regularly, I'm going to dilute my paints, and it'll be harder to get the dark values I really want. So if I'm going to come into, if my paints are already nice and reconstituted, which these are, I don't need this much water coming into my palette. So I might take a little water off. I can come to a color, oh, never mind, I need a little bit more than that. I can come in and pick up some paint, blend in with what I have, and obviously the drier or the less water you're adding in, the darker your value will be, right? Less water, more paint is darker. Paint straight from the tube is as dark as you're going to get for that particular color. And then as I add water to that, if I rinse my brush out and just add some water, I'm going to get lighter values. I'm sure this is familiar. So the idea in here with the brush, the beauty of the brush, number one is how much water you're going to bring into your palette. But the other piece here is, so if I mix a nice big puddle, which, you want often, nice huge puddles of paint to work with, you don't always want to bring that big puddle over to your paper. If I'm doing a small shape and I bring my brush over, I've got limits to how small I can paint a shape and have it be clean. I don't know if you can see that, but that's a very tall bubble with the shape. For illustration, with a side view, if this was my piece of paper, this stroke I just painted looks something like that. There's a lot of water there. And in that water, of course, is all our little bits of paint pigment suspended in there. As the water evaporates away, we're left with all of this pigment. Gravity has time. This is going to take longer to dry than a drier application. Gravity is going to have time to pull that pigment to the sides, and I will probably end up with a shape there eventually when it dries, where the center is lighter, the outside edges are darker. That might be just the effect you want, in which case, great. If that's not what you're going for, you didn't want quite so much water on your brush in the first place. So I can come back to that same puddle, and now if I take a little bit of the paint off before I come to my paper, I can paint a similar shape that's not nearly so much of a puddle. And it's a really big value difference coming from this same mix of paint here, right? So if I spread this out, this is the same value. It came from the same puddle. I just had so much there that there is more pigment in it. It will look drier or darker when it dries. So whether you want light, dark, whatever value you're working with, it's nice to be able to control how much water is in your brush when you go to make your shapes on your paper. Now, if you're a wet into wet painter, that's going to work different than if you're a dry on dry painter or anywhere in between. But in any of these places, there is a control that you want, however much the amount of water and paint that's on your brush when you bring it to your paper, whether it's wet or dry, will change the look and the effect that you will get. I could do a whole day's workshop on learning how to know what you're going to get with each different combination. How wet's my paper? How wet is my brush? But you can learn that on your own too, just with trial and error. So this is my big tip. I love the sponge. Make sure it's fully saturated, wrung out all the way. It does not matter if it gets all gunked up with paint. It really doesn't matter. It's very rare that I end up picking up color on my brush, but I will do a thing where the side closest to my water is usually cleaner and this side maybe gets darker. You can flip it, you can rinse it out. But that really isn't an issue. Don't be fearful about getting your sponge dirty. The beautiful thing in here, again, is you can learn with practice how to make the shapes you want with the amount of water you want and not have it be a big, drippy, uncontrolled mess. Similarly, if you want it really, really dry, you're going to really dry that brush out. You can get all these nice scratchy looks with your same brush too. And then you can come back in and do, something else in between them. I will make one more comment here. I said this was not going to be a lesson on the full gamut of water control, just kind of highlighting how I use my sponge. But one thing to keep in mind, the way brushes are designed, when you saturate the brush, you're getting water all the way into the inside of this body of the brush. That's where your paint flows from. So if you're wanting a nice fluid, larger application, having a brush like this that's a bit bigger, I can get pretty controlled. Well, actually, I've worn the point off this pretty well, but I can get pretty decent detail with a brush like this, which is relatively large. With this larger body, it will hold quite a lot of paint. So if I'm painting a large shape, which I'm just going to make a mess, as I paint larger, when I start to run out of paint at some point here, and it gets dry, there's a point you can come pick up more paint and keep going to fill in your area, whatever you're making. This is not how I would usually paint, but it's an illustration. At some point, you're not going to be able to fill the inside of that body of the brush with your puddle from your palette. At some point, you'll want to give a really good dunk and swish to fully resaturate the inside of that body. Take off the extra water and then come back into your same puddle. And now it'll pull back in there. It works the same way as your dry sponge versus a wet sponge. If I try to take water off my brush, this will pull some off, but not nearly as well as a wet sponge. When your bristles are already wet, if they're not dripping wet, they will hold more paint than a dry brush can hold. So if you're trying to do a large area and you find that as you keep coming back in, it gets scratchier and scratchier, or as you come back in and pick up your puddle, you're getting a pushback bleed effect, probably what happened is your brush was drying out too much before you picked up more paint, and you need to have stopped earlier and re-wet that, resaturated the whole body of the brush. I hope that makes sense. I'm not sure if that does. And since we're here, one other quick tip, since I don't know if you can see this on my palette, I've got some dried paint over here. Just a suggestion, if you're like me and you wind up working, you have, all sorts of things mixed across your palette that you come back in and reuse, keep in mind, if you go to reconstitute this, you don't want to get in here and have it be just all dry and scratchy. This isn't too bad. But see how it's not much of a puddle? There's not a lot of water there. If I'm doing one tiny shape only, that's probably fine. If I'm going to use this to get into and do on a bigger painting and keep using it, and I'm going to run out, this is going to be really problematic really quickly because this is not that wet for this size of brush. When I use this up, I'll just wipe that out in my paper. When I use this up and come back in, it's going to be a drier and drier puddle, and it's going to get to a point where I can't get nice flow coming off my brush. And I do work very controlled. I do work often drier on wetter, or I'm sorry, wetter on drier. So a brush, boy, I can't talk this morning. More moisture in my brush and drier paper. It's very controlled. I don't have so much paint on here that I'm getting uncontrollable blobs and things happening, but I have a pretty good flow of paint off my brush. So I'm really getting that nice watercolory look as I lay paint down. There's a point where you end up with just these kind of scratchy marks, which if that's a texture you're going for, that's wonderful, but I would like it to be purposeful for you and not an accidental thing. So just word to the wise, be careful about coming in and trying to reconstitute some of these for doing much. You probably just want to remix right on top of that and incorporate this into a new larger puddle. You know, paint goes quick. It lasts a long time, but it does go quick. And so it's always nice to make more than you think you'll need. You'll probably use it anyways. And it's a lot better to have too much and save it than to run out and be trying to mix the same color as whatever you're painting is starting to dry. That doesn't usually work out all that well. So sponge, I highly recommend. Again, I can fully saturate my brush and I can control how much water is left on there. You can look at the sheen if you do this for yourself and watch how the sheen diminishes on the brush each time you set it down. And do some experimenting. It takes a little practice, but really not much. The sponge is a really nice quick replacement for the paper towel. If you want really dry, scratchy looks, you can get that here too. You're just going to hold your brush down for longer. This works for any kind of brush. The bigger your brush, this is still on the small side. It's just a 1-inch flat. If you get into like a 1.5, 2-inch brush that you're using for things that's pulling up so much water, you will end up having to wring your brush out or your sponge out because it will get very saturated with a brush that can retain that much water. But that's why I like this size. When I'm traveling, sometimes I'll use a small one. It's less convenient. It fills up faster, but it takes less space. So sometimes that's just the trade-off. But for home studio work, can't recommend this more. A nice, great big, large kitchen cellulose sponge. They're about $5. Great investment. Last for years and years. Oh, one last tip. Have you ever, if you work with a small brush ever, have you ever had this happen to you where you dunk your small brush in and you're painting away and one of these drips of water works its way down and makes a little explosion on your paper? With a sponge, when you use a small brush, you can get into this habit of just kind of twisting and rubbing up the edge to pull all of the water off the sides of the brush handle so that you're not going to get an unexpected drip coming off and onto your paper. Extra little tip. That's all for today. Thanks for watching.